Forget everything you know about modern relationships. In the 1400s, love wasn't about dating apps or candlelit dinners. It was about power, property, bloodlines, survival, and sometimes even passion. Let's travel back to a time when marriage was business, love was war, and the heart had very little say. In the 1400s, relationships were strategic. Marriage was a binding contract, not just between two individuals, but between two families, two estates, or even two kingdoms. Especially among the nobility, marriage served as a tool to secure alliances, increase landholdings, or settle disputes. The idea of marrying for love was rare. In fact, it was discouraged. For example, in England and across Europe, kings and queens often arranged marriages for their children before they could even walk. These were not emotional unions, they were political maneuvers. Among peasants, the stakes were different, but the motivations were still survival-based. A peasant man might choose a wife who could work the land, raise children, and support the family economy. A woman, meanwhile, often looked for stability and protection. Love could happen, but it was usually an accident. If marriage was business, then courtship was the negotiation phase. Among the upper classes, courtship was less about flirting and more about inspecting assets, financial and otherwise. A noblewoman's value was often measured by her dowry, the wealth, land, or livestock her family offered to her future husband. In Italy, dowries were so crucial that families went bankrupt trying to marry off daughters. A nobleman might gift rings, poems, or song performances to woo a potential bride. But behind the romantic veneer were letters, contracts, and sometimes entire council meetings between families to determine terms. Among commoners, things were more organic, but not by much. Village festivals or church gatherings were the main avenues to meet potential partners. But even then, families had the final say. Medieval society was rigidly patriarchal. A woman's role was to obey, reproduce, and serve, whether in the castle or the cottage. Once married, a woman became her husband's legal property in many regions. She couldn't own land, file lawsuits, or make decisions independently. In noble households, women were often secluded, their virtue policed to ensure pure bloodlines. Yet some women carved out influence. Noble women could manage estates, especially if their husbands were at war. In rare cases, like Margaret of Anjou or Isabella of France, women even ruled, albeit through immense struggle. For peasant women, daily life was grueling. They farmed, birthed children, cooked and cleaned, often while pregnant again. But their contributions were vital. The gender imbalance in power, though, shaped every romantic and marital interaction. Love often took a back seat to duty and survival. Religion governed relationships in the 1400s. The Catholic Church dictated when, how, and with whom people could marry. Sex outside of marriage, a sin. Divorce, nearly impossible. Annulments, rare and often granted only to the wealthy or powerful. Weddings had to occur in a church, and the union had to be sanctioned by a priest. Premarital intimacy was strictly taboo, although it still happened, especially among peasants. Adultery was a grave sin and, for women, could lead to public shaming, imprisonment, or even death. For men, punishments were milder, especially if they were wealthy. Celibacy before marriage was praised, particularly for women. Virginity was seen as a badge of honor, even a bargaining chip. But behind the sermons and rituals, real human emotions stirred. Secret affairs happened, some tragic, some scandalous, and some immortalized in poems. Forbidden love in the 1400s could cost you everything. Lovers caught in adulterous affairs faced severe consequences, especially noble women, whose unfaithfulness threatened bloodlines and dynasties. Some of the era's biggest scandals involved queens and mistresses. Take Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France, rumored to have had multiple affairs while her husband suffered from mental illness. Her reputation was shattered, though never confirmed, and yet mistresses often held power. Kings, especially in France and England, frequently had official mistresses, some of whom wielded influence rivaling queens. Among peasants, extramarital affairs were more likely to go unnoticed unless someone got pregnant. Then came shame, exile, or forced marriage. Same-sex relationships were strictly condemned. Though they existed, they had to be deeply secret. If discovered, punishments ranged from public flogging to execution. But love, in all its defiance, still bloomed. In taverns, in shadows, in stolen moments. In the 1400s, the concept of age of consent was nearly non-existent by today's standards. Girls as young as 12 and boys as young as 14 could legally marry in many parts of Europe. These were not symbolic ceremonies, they were real unions, consummated and recognized by the church. Among nobility, child marriage was common, often for political gain. These young brides were expected to leave their homes and adapt to new lives, far from their families. Consent, particularly for women, was irrelevant. Fathers or male guardians made decisions, and refusal could result in punishment or exile. Even among commoners, economic pressures meant early marriages, especially for girls, were encouraged. Only later in the Renaissance and Reformation did the idea of informed consent begin to emerge. Despite the harsh conditions, romance did exist. The 1400s saw the rise of courtly love, a cultural ideal where knights would pledge undying devotion to noble women, often unattainable ones. These relationships were rarely consummated, but involved poetry, tokens, and secret messages. Love letters were written in Latin, French, or local dialects, some preserved to this day. They spoke of longing, heartbreak, and hope. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Petrarch's sonnets reflect this romantic undercurrent in medieval thought. They reveal that even in a world ruled by contracts and obligations, the heart still found ways to speak. Over time, some arranged marriages did evolve into companionship, even love. Couples who survived childbirth, famine, and plague together often developed strong bonds. Shared struggle forged intimacy. Some letters between older medieval couples reveal deep affection, not at the start, but through years of resilience. These relationships weren't perfect, but they were real, built on endurance, mutual reliance, and sometimes, against all odds, romance. So, what were relationships really like in the 1400s? They were brutal, complex, strategic, but also strangely familiar. Because even in a world of arranged marriages, dowries, and religious laws, people still longed, still hoped, still loved. Maybe that's the most human truth of all.